I can show people even a little more of the diversity in the world, I'll be happy. It'll mean I've helped build a world where folks accept and appreciate each other's differences. Opening minds by showing them new things. Didn't know you were such a profound thinker.
In the 3 years since I began this channel, I've received several requests to discuss trans subtext in Fire Emblem. That's reasonably within my field of interest, considering how many videos I've made exploring the extremely mixed bag that is gay content in this series. However, I hesitated on that point for quite some time, for 2 reasons. The first is that there just isn't anywhere near as much to talk about, especially if we're attempting to pinpoint trans characters specifically, as opposed to a broader overview of writing in Fire Emblem that points to any kind of queer relationship with gender identity or the gender binary. If you clicked on this video, there's a pretty good chance that you can already list off most, if not all, of the roughly half-dozen characters that you can expect me to highlight here. The range of examples of even gender non-conforming characters in Fire Emblem is much narrower than it is for those you could easily read something gay into. And for that matter, it's also a topic much less explored by the fandom. The second, more straightforward reason I avoided this subject was that, outside of very particular situations that I'm not going to delve into, I am cis, and mostly gender conforming. Therefore, I didn't feel like I could speak about this kind of subtext with the same level of confidence that I do when it comes to gay subtext, especially where it involves men. I didn't like the idea of leaving it there, though. So over the last few months, I reached out to a number of trans and non-binary friends of mine who are also familiar with Fire Emblem, and who would be willing to offer me their insight during the script writing process. It may not seem like it from the outside, but this is by far my most collaborative project on YouTube to date. A massive thank you to everyone who helped me out with putting together this video. This is not something I could have tackled on my own. One last important note before we really get into it. I am deliberately avoiding the use of the term representation in this video. The word representation implies intention, that the creators of a piece of media deliberately sought to include characters or situations that lie on the margins of what audiences typically expect to see, often for the purposes of providing some type of social commentary from a marginalized perspective. While one could absolutely point to certain moments in Fire Emblem as affirming or resonant for any number of reasons, and God knows I have, I cannot in good conscience look at this franchise in its entirety and reasonably conclude that Intelligent Systems has ever prioritized representation of any sort. This is crucial to keep in mind because there are a good number of cases of characters bucking the gender binary in these games in ways that are intended purely for comedic effect, and that are usually pretty offensive to boot. As uncomfortable as these examples can be, I can't overlook them. They're still part of the conversation here, in the same way that Devdin has to come up if we're talking about racism and depictions of characters of color, or how Heroes and its fan service-laden ethos can't be ignored when talking about misogyny in this franchise. There is an element of applicability and fan engagement that we're going to discuss later on, but to get the ball rolling, we do kind of have to get the cringier bits out of the way first. So let's get into that. Many a video essay has already expounded upon the once common phenomenon of the queer-coded villain, the practice of giving antagonist traits stereotypically associated with gay and/or trans people as a signal to the audience that these characters are bad people and not intended to be sympathetic. The most positive way you could ever spin this is that when done well, these characters can be good for some campy fun, especially in stories where the leads are comparatively bland. Disney used to be good at creating villains like these, once upon a time. Intelligent Systems, on the other hand, not so much. The most commonly recurring queer-coded villains in Fire Emblem are those colloquially referred to as the Bara Bandits, after an antiquated Japanese pejorative for gay men with a complicated history of reclamation and reapplication among non-Japanese audiences. First appearing in Binding Blade, these minor bosses are always bald, muscular men in some heavy infantry class like Warrior or Berserker. But unlike the dozens of other one-off bandit bosses no one ever cares to remember, these guys are pretty much guaranteed to leave an impression in the worst way imaginable. Their dialogue is campy and effeminate. They're sometimes implied to be a little too into each other, even though they're usually brothers, and some of them even have women's names, like the OG duo Maggie and Rose. The dissonance between these characters' hyper-masculine looks and effeminate behavior is the joke, such as it is. You're meant to find them funny, but also not have a problem with mowing them down and moving on to the next chapter. A few games do a bit more with them, like Awakening's Victor and Vincent popping up all over the place for more comedic bits, or Fates' pair being technically recruitable via the capture mechanic, although units obtained in that way don't get any additional dialogue of note, so don't hold out on any expectations of these guys actually getting any development. That's par for the course for single chapter bosses like these, who are, for all practical purposes, only one step above generics in terms of how much players are expected to care about killing them. But to do so with this kind of presentation, and to have it recur across 6 different games to date, is not a good look. At best, the Bara Bandits are so flatly characterized that you'd be hard-pressed to remember that they're even there, such as is the case in their latest appearance in Engage. Which still isn't great, mind you, but better to be forgettable than to be memorable for all the wrong reasons. They're not the only instance of this trope in action in Fire Emblem. Valtome from Radiant Dawn follows in the lengthy tradition of giving minor villains grotesque designs to quickly indicate that they are neither likable nor recruitable. This particular character, though, stands out among the ranks of one-off bosses with sour expressions and bad haircuts, and even from the rest of the generally reprehensible Benyon Senate. The unusually textured hair, the little ornamental flourishes on his outfit, the fey positioning of his hand. Even before you delve into his weird obsessions with both Alincia and Zelgius, you're supposed to take one look at this guy, conclude that there's something off about him, and anticipate getting to kick his ass. As with the Bara Bandits, Valtome's presentation exists in a gray space between gay and gender nonconforming, easily hitting notes of both without committing to either because, of course, we're still well within the realm of characters who never grow or change and are meant to be hated. While we're at it, I would lump Cleobulus and Three Hopes in that category as well, but there's a fairly good chance that that single indicative pronoun was just a mistranslation. And in any case, Cornelia on her own terms decidedly belongs to the vampy female villain archetype instead, more an Aversa than an Excellus. Because, yeah, there's Excellus, one of the many secondary antagonists of Awakening's Vom arc. At first, Excellus's design is quite reminiscent of Valtome's, only with an even worse haircut, makeup, and painted nails to really underscore just how much every moment this character has on screen is going to suck. If that wasn't bad enough, in his cameo appearance as a boss in Tokyo Mirage Sessions, Excellus has prominent breasts, because why not? But in the context of the original Japanese, he's somehow even worse. There, Excellus uses feminine pronouns and verbal tics, and Aversa at one point refers to him as a eunuch, although it's not clear whether she's speaking literally. In combination with his appearance, these identify him as an Okama stereotype, an offensive caricature bundling together a whole range of queer identities from feminine gay men to male crossdressers to trans women. While I can't pretend to have more than secondhand knowledge of Japanese media outside of a handful of video game IPs, I will point out that the intentional conflation of gay men and trans women is not a foreign concept in the West, whether in the form of early explanations for homosexuality involving male brains and female brains, or in today's conservative bigots confusing cis drag queens with trans women as they attempt to litigate both out of existence. I may not be familiar with most of the other examples of Okama in Japanese media I came across in my research, but I do understand why, from a hetero cis-normative perspective, a character like this would come across as comically off-putting. Which is especially true when, again, we're talking about a villain with zero redeeming qualities, who's ultimately nothing more than the put-upon underling to a much bigger threat. And he gets to be recruited in the postgame and can even father a child with the Avatar despite being sort of undead at that point. Oh, Awakening, you're so screwed up, it's incredible that you're still so fondly remembered. But while we're talking about Okama, unless it's specifically built into their narrative from the beginning, it can be difficult for a fictional character to experience any sort of meaningful queer journey. The most obvious exception to this are characters who make multiple appearances across a long-running franchise, with different writers bringing fresh perspectives and creative heads making adjustments to suit changing social landscapes. Fire Emblem's most well-known example there is Kiza, an extremely minor playable character from Radiant Dawn who's undergone quite the unexpected queer journey in the 17 years since they were introduced. At least, unexpected by international audiences, as localized Kiza is just a stuffy male tiger who's implied to have a crush on Ranulf that's played entirely for comedy. In the same vein as a handful of other characters from the same game because Tellius just loves that gay subtext. But the Japanese script tells a different story. There, Kiza switches between masculine and feminine first-person pronouns depending on the scene, which is apparently enough for the series' 20th anniversary art book to label the character an Okama despite the lack of any obvious indicators in their visual design. This is the same game that Valtome is in, so the artist certainly could have gone there, but they didn't. Instead, Kiza is a character who could easily fly under the radar for anyone unaware of this particular aspect of their original dialogue. There are several different interpretations here as well. One, of course, being that Kiza is trans and is possibly in the closet about their identity, only sharing it with characters they're close to. Another is that they are what the internet would refer to as a she-her gay, a cis queer man who sometimes uses feminine pronouns as an affectation or term of endearment around others. A third option would be that it's something that can't properly be conveyed in English at all. While I have very little knowledge of the Japanese language, I can surmise that its variable first-person pronouns allow for a range of personal expression that simply can't be replicated with the invariable I, and that can at best be conveyed indirectly through other means. I mean, Anglophones already struggle with the idea of the Romance languages distinguishing levels of formality in the second person. There's no way they're going to easily manage the nuances of a language with around a dozen first-person pronouns, each communicating something different about the speaker's gender, age, and/or social status relative to the person they're addressing. Although, as everyone knows, that isn't the end of Kiza's story. They made an appearance in Fire Emblem Heroes for the 2022 New Year's banner, sporting a festive holiday kimono and, to the surprise of many, they-them pronouns. Their attraction to Ranulf has been left intact, as has their rivalry with Lyre, so in every other respect, this is fully consistent with how the character was localized back in 2007. This is comparable to how Heroes has dealt with Limstella from Blazing Blade, another character originally introduced with a binary gender who is now considered to be an officially genderless, artificial construct. Bramamon from the same game is somewhat in the same boat, but it would require you to read his total loss of self due to dark magic as a sort of fantasy disability that doesn't erase his own gender identity. So is all this a landmark moment in Fire Emblem's handling of queer characters? While it generated a bit of conversation at the time, there's only so much that can be gotten out of a seasonal event in a mobile gacha. Doubly so since Kiza is such a minor character with very little to remark on beyond their queerness. In that regard, they're a lot like Heather from the same game, who's brought up almost solely in reference to the overtness of her attraction to women because that's like 95% of her character. I can't fathom IS going out of its way to honor Kiza's non-binary identity, especially in a game with an annual voting event that groups characters along a strict gender binary. If Kiza somehow got rallied into the top 20 of Choose Your Legends one year, I'd bet anything that they'd just be stuck on the men's side of the ranking without a second thought. As we'll explore more a bit later, Fire Emblem has always loved its mechanical binaries. I can't take credit for this observation, but it has been remarked that Forest stands out as the only definitive cisgender heterosexual character in all of Fire Emblem. That is to say, we have in-game dialogue establishing that he identifies as male and that this corresponds with his birth gender, as well as affirming that he is attracted to women but not men. Tongue-in-cheek though this conclusion may be, it is nonetheless a testament to how easy it can be to default to a cis, heteronormative reading of media, that it's often only challenged whenever we're faced with something outside the expected norm, like, for example, a male character who prefers to wear women's clothes. And that preference is the primary takeaway from Forest, arguably the most all-around positive portrayal of gender nonconformity that Fire Emblem has ever given us. Like the others highlighted in this video, Forest also belongs to an established character type that's cropped up here and there over the course of the series. In his case, it's feminine-looking male characters whose appearances are commented on in the script, typically as a source of humor. Think Lucius from Blazing Blade, or Libra from Awakening as the most overplayed example because that game is just determined to be the absolute worst all around. The dialogue of Forest Paralogue sets up that expectation early on, but once he's done wrangling with his father's own insecurities, remarkably little of Forest writing is dedicated to jokes about him looking like a girl. Cis and straight though he may be, there's a palpable queer joy to his character. Forest is appropriately one of several characters in Fates who break the mold with regard to the series' traditionally gendered classes, like Charlotte and Rinka breaking into the ranks of Axe Infantry, or Tsubaki riding a Pegasus. Forest breaks new ground in the typically female-only mounted healer class, and without the deliberate overlay of domestic service that Jacob and Dwyer bring to the same role. More significantly, many of Forest's supports present him with the opportunity to show off his knowledge of fashion and share it with his friends. Even his support line with his father is surprisingly uplifting, giving Leo a chance to make amends for being close-minded in the past and to better understand his son's perspective. It's certainly a far cry from the explicitly gay Leon just one game later in Echoes, whose writing is fraught with unrequited attraction and the anxieties of an aging twink. Even in comparison to other characters in his own game, and even in light of Fates' notoriously dodgy localization, Forest is remarkably affirming. Where the localizers had to awkwardly maneuver around existing S-ranks when adjusting Soleil's writing to be less obviously offensive, establishing her bisexuality but still unable to see that play out mechanically in her romance options, Forest is under no such limitations. Well, there is one, but we'll come back to that. You could perhaps question the localizer's decision to leave Soleil's supports with Forest as one of her only S-ranks to be kept romantic, and what, if anything, that might indicate about how they read Forest's gender presentation. In the full context of this series, however, I'm content to call it a net positive. And now we've arrived at the present, or the present of a year and a half ago, anyway. Rosado continues in the tradition of male characters with feminine designs, to the point that during pre-release he was sometimes confused for a woman. That didn't last for long, however, after it was pointed out that Rosado exclusively uses masculine pronouns in the Japanese script. In part because Engage just never generated the level of controversy that Fates did, Rosado was accepted by the player base with relatively little fanfare compared to Forest. In truth, though, this is also a consequence of Engage's writing playing it a lot safer than Fate's all around. There's nothing comparable here to Fates' exploration of Forest and his journey of self-discovery. Instead, Rosado hails from what he refers to as a village of the fair folk, whose understanding of the world around them transcends concepts like gender. And sure, that's a pretty thought, but Rosado's village also exists entirely off-screen, with no connection whatsoever to the rest of the game's world building or even to the series' more common supernatural elements. The only fairies I can think of in all of Fire Emblem are the characters from that one book of heroes. And more seriously, learning that a character's unique relationship to the gender binary stems from them being essentially raised by fairies just doesn't resonate in the same way as what Forest describes of his own developing relationship to gender presentation. Still, Rosado does get some good interactions involving his artistic interests and his relationship to the concept of cuteness, which, awkwardly shoehorned in references to social media culture aside, do at least hit many of the same notes of the value of finding outlets for personal expression. I don't think Rosado is a bad character by any means, certainly not when held up against most of Fire Emblem's older forays into gender nonconformity. It's unfortunate that Aleer is the only character to engage with the equivalent of S-rank conversations or paired endings, because it would have been interesting to see some of Rosato's other support lines followed up on in ways that explore how his understanding of gender intersects with his romantic inclinations. Even if his pact ring conversation hadn't been rendered a bit awkwardly platonic, that's not really something Rosato is capable of conveying to Aleer because of how avatars are written. And yes, now we're coming to my most consistently recurring point of discussion in my Fire Emblem videos, namely that the avatars kind of suck. From the outset, the concept of the Fire Emblem avatar is a small step forward in terms of inclusive, immersive gameplay. Gender-variable, customizable self-inserts are commonplace in games from epic RPGs to just about every cozy farming sim ever made. And in Fire Emblem, avatars are positioned as alternatives to the well-defined, and more often male, lord characters that have been headlining these games since the Famicom days. But this isn't Baldur's Gate, or Stardew Valley, or even something less in-depth like Pokémon. Fire Emblem's primary draw beyond its tactical challenge has always been its character writing that often nods toward the gendered world that these characters inhabit. Avatars, by their very design, are incapable of existing fully within that same gendered context, on account of having what one might call Schrodinger's gender. That is, they are simultaneously both, and also neither, male and female, until the player observes their gender in the form of choosing one. And even then, it's not as though this gives the avatar a definitive gender. Players can pick the other option for a different playthrough, or even just when they're browsing through the support log or event gallery. And IS treats the two genders of the same avatar as separate characters outside of their source games, even if that conflicts with their occupying identical narrative spaces. And compounding this is the fact that as the avatar has become more and more entrenched in modern Fire Emblem, the writing surrounding them has gradually lost any meaningful distinction of gender. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the often goofy variations in Robin supports based on their gender were anything good, but at least they indicate that the writers were thinking of the avatar as a gendered character existing within the unapologetically heteronormative world of Awakening. Cut to Fates and beyond, and most of those identifiable markers are all gone, even more so in localization. For undoubtedly the most glaring omission, take Byleth serving as the mortal vessel to a definitively female deity. Three Houses, and even Three Hopes, have nothing to say with regard to how Sothis' relationship to Byleth and their body might differ if that body happens to be male. I've seen some fan responses to Sothis' voice coming from possessed male Byleth's body in Hopes that call it unsettling or creepy, and yeah, that's got some implications. IS has even returned to that same well in Heroes with Grima-possessed female Robin. They sure aren't going to do anything to call attention to what that situation might entail for Robin or Grima, but they also aren't going to skimp on the fan service either. And of course, the avatar's gender isn't purely a matter of aesthetics and occasionally S-ranks. There's also gender-locked classes, a consistent element of Fire Emblem unit design going all the way back to the beginning, when reclassing wasn't a thing. Usually when people bring up the problems with gender lock, it's from a gameplay perspective, since one gender will often get tactically superior exclusive options which can make some characters better or worse for a purely arbitrary reason. But especially with reclassing, gender lock really has a way of, well, locking characters into that binary. Rosato can't access his own default base class, because it happens to be the only generic female exclusive one in Engage. Forrest promotes to butler rather than maid, even if it clashes horribly with his preferred look and somewhat undercuts the significance of placing him in a traditionally female-only class in the first place. Kiza is a tiger, the same hypermasculine class/species as Radiant Dawn's iteration of the Bara Bandits. Arval from Three Hopes is apparently non-binary or genderless, but if you look at their list of class options, they actually do have a binary gender that just always happens to match that of the game's avatar, even though there is literally no distinction for them outside of those exclusive classes. It's similar to that issue with Choose Your Legends that I brought up earlier. These games operate under the assumption that the gender binary exists and can't really be deviated from, both as a gameplay limitation and as a restriction on how characters can be written. Just as we'll never have a monosexual gay character in any Fire Emblem with an avatar, because they're required to be able to romance in some form or another every opposite-sex character at minimum, so too will we never see an actually trans character in this series, so long as having one would require the writers to think about how such a character would be impacted by gendered mechanics. And I'm not holding my breath on that point. It can even get in the way of developers who are trying to write more inclusively. For that, I'm going to highlight the ROM hack Sacred Echoes, a demake of Shadows of Valentia that I already praised quite a bit last year. In addition to the 20 or so other reasons you should check out this project if you're at all a fan of Echoes, it's worth noting here because the writers took the time and care to include a trans character. And not even one created from scratch either. They took Jessie, in the original only one of several underdeveloped mercenary characters, and used details from the official art book as well as material of their own creation to write him as a trans man. This is a remarkably organic change, one that preserves Jessie's original characterization as an affable, womanizing flirt, while also building upon his friendship with Clive established in supplementary material to touch upon his gender dysphoria and his path to realizing his identity as a man. Meanwhile, Clive gets to be the supportive cishet ally, which is a role he also gets to take on elsewhere thanks to other significant and overall positive alterations. That said though, Sacred Echoes is still saddled with the strictly gendered villager promotions of the Valentia games, and it gets around addressing Jesse's place in this binary by making him a thief, a class not present in the official game that falls outside of both gender-based promotion trees. Personally, I don't fault the developers for that decision. I don't believe that there would ever be a solution to that problem that would satisfy all or even most players. It's just necessary baggage in this strange franchise where flying horses won't let men ride them because reasons, and where women couldn't figure out how to use a bow until 4 games in. Funny how Sacred Echoes managed to fix that second one too. Just more of this, please. And it does, indeed, often come down to the fans if you're looking for meaningful queer content in Fire Emblem. That's the flip side to representation that I mentioned in the intro, applicability, where the focus lies not on the intentions of the creators of a piece of media, but rather in how different audiences respond to media and apply it to their own experiences. Similar to the gay hacks of the 3DS games that significantly diversify the range of available same-sex support options in those titles, Sacred Echoes is the most prominent example I can think of a Fire Emblem fan project adding trans representation to an existing game. Doubly so, too, because you might have noticed that all of the examples I highlighted from official releases have one thing in common, that all of them are, at least as far as can be determined, AMAB, that is, characters who were assigned male at birth. Nothing IS has ever put out in this franchise has ever nodded toward trans men, or toward women or other AFAB characters with a relationship to their gender that falls outside the binary. The only noteworthy example that even comes close in my mind is Lucina cosplaying as Marth. And even then, that scenario is never once about Lucina assuming the identity of a man, but rather that of a legendary hero within the lore who just happens to be male. I attribute that to a number of factors, with arguably the biggest one being the way that modern IS commodifies the female characters of this franchise in a way that demands that they be marketable to their straight male demographic. Case in point, just look at what Heroes is doing in any given month. Or how about the contrast between the extremely feminine Rosado and the only just butch enough to not be alienating Marin from Engage? Just as Shadows of Valentia itself is rife with tired misogynistic tropes while also having the space to accommodate male characters who exist all along the queer spectrum. Or that point I made about dark magic in the Fovlin games and how it paints all of the women who use it as traumatized torture victims, while male dark mages get to go to all sorts of evil, hammy places with the same material, so too do AMAB characters have more freedom to exist in ways that challenge their relationships to the gender binary, because the majority of them simply aren't as valuable from a marketing perspective. Funny what you can get away with when making a profit is completely taken out of the equation. But you don't need to make an entire ROM hack to leave your own mark in the fandom. There's a wealth of fan work out there of all forms that work to address IS's numerous representational shortcomings. Fans have reframed Forrest as a trans woman, or interpreted the avatars as non-binary in a recognizably human way rather than in a way that could only apply to video game characters. And like Trans Jessie, there's plenty of room for more inventive trans narratives within the realm of Fire Emblem fan work. I once had a blog mutual who sometimes read Finn of the Yggdrasil games as a trans man. That's not an easy sell logistically, since genealogy is all about the biological baby making. But nonetheless, it's a fascinating interpretation of a layered character with such a substantial role in the plots of two different games. Looking at a more modern example, Yunaka's been a popular subject for trans-feminine headcanons, because there's relatable material to be had in her anxieties over people looking into her past, and in her talent for changing her voice. For myself, I can easily look at Ferdinand from Three Houses and read into him at least a passing interest in stage drag. Given his relationship with Hubert, and both characters' very different hang-ups involving Edelgard, I could see that comfort with cross-dressing and or gender fluidity evolving into some very inventive bedroom activities. And that's just a headcanon that I can pull partly from my own experiences, and then apply to one of my favorite Fodlan ships. Hubert's got some of that going on himself with his secret desire to be a Pegasus Knight, and trans male Felix in a relationship with Sylvain or Dimitri is likewise such a widely popular headcanon and fanfic that I could almost deserve its own video tying it into broader fandom trends. Though you'll have to look elsewhere for that. I'm not a big enough channel to be analyzing the broader ebb and flow of transformative fandom. And transformative is indeed the key word here. To tie all this together in a way that relates to pride in a more general sense. Fictional characters are dolls. They are to be played with. The Fire Emblem online player base knows full well that some of its most prominent members became so because of the ways in which they push the series' potential for tactical challenge to its limit, whether that's in the form of working out the most efficient strategies and units, or in hacking the games to make them harder. We take it for granted that the intentions of the developers are being set aside whenever we watch someone do a run with 0% growth, or reverse recruitment, or even just pull off an Iron Man run in any game outside the Kaga era. So why then do many of these same fandom elements balk at the thought of applying the same mentality of ignoring creator intent to the character's romantic inclinations, or to their gender identities? Obviously the answer is queerphobia, duh, but it's a logical inconsistency that I believe needs to be interrogated more often. The modern fandom is a volatile mixture of elitist tactical nerds and parasocially projecting dating sim enthusiasts and the absolute mess that is the Fodlan fandom in its entirety, and IS certainly knows it. They'll keep finding new and inventive ways to spice up their gameplay, but they'll also take their extremely commercialized waifus all the way to the bank, coasting off the horny goodwill of cishet men aged 21 to 35 with disposable incomes and poor impulse control. And just as I'm confident in saying that someone out there is humping an Edelgard body pillow as I speak, the rest of us can have our queer headcanons as a treat. And so, as a treat, go ahead and share your favorite trans and non-binary Fire Emblem headcanons, or talk about your thoughts on the bits that we have to work with in canon. I'd like to give a huge thank you again to everyone who contributed ideas and feedback for this video. Unlike other queer content that I put out on this channel, I couldn't just sit back and rely on my endless capacity to squee over my favorite ships. So hearing from a variety of perspectives was crucial in getting this one to come together. Have a happy and decadent Pride, everyone. Au revoir.